Welcome back to part 2 of the apparently hour-long Steam Deck frequently asked questions video thing. Will local wireless play be possible like with Nintendo Switch or 3DS? I should explain what this means first. When playing on a Switch or 3DS, a lot of games allow you to find and join other local players in multiplayer games without needing to be connected to Wi-Fi. Meaning you and a friend can be in the middle of a Wisconsin playground, turn on your Switches, and then directly play Monster Hunter together without needing a proper internet connection. Steam not only wouldn't permit this, it's actually much worse. Steam at its core is basically a form of always online DRM. So not only would you and your friend not be able to play multiplayer games together, you probably wouldn't be able to play single-player games. The exception being if you had the presence of mind to specially authorize your Steam Deck for offline play prior to disconnecting from the internet. Or if you tethered your Steam Deck to your phone, perhaps just long enough to authorize it for offline play, then disconnected it. This is such an ass-backwards situation for what's being advertised as a portable game system that I have to assume Valve is working on a special provision for Steam Decks, but it would be extremely naive to buy one with that assumption. My best guess would be that they do implement a workaround, but it only works under SteamOS. Hopefully this is one of the things reviewers will focus on. However, getting back to the original question, if we remove Steam DRM from the equation entirely, it should theoretically be possible to play local area network multiplayer-enabled games together, but PC games generally stopped being developed with LAN play in mind decades ago. The selection of games that allow direct internet connections from one user to another is unfortunately very narrow nowadays. This is one area where Nintendo will continue to have an upper hand. Does the Steam Deck have a touchscreen? Yes, it has a multi-touch touchscreen. I'm pretty sure I read it can detect up to 10 touch points, but now I can't find the source where I read that. 10 touch points is pretty standard though, so it's a safe bet. This hasn't been announced officially, but as far as I know, there's nothing stopping Valve from letting you add virtual buttons to the touchscreen for extra inputs if there aren't enough buttons on the console itself. Or you could set it up so when you hold down certain buttons, a bunch of virtual buttons pop up on the touchscreen to choose from. This would be useful for simulators, for example, where there's tons of extra inputs you only rarely need to use, and it would save a lot of complexity compared to remembering a bunch of button combinations. Does Steam Deck not have enough VRAM? The Steam Deck has 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is shared between the GPU and CPU. That should be plenty. But since I have your attention, let me get this out of the way. VRAM limitations are generally overblown and misunderstood. Games commonly reserve all the VRAM they can get, and monitoring software reports this reserved RAM as being in use even when it's never needed. VRAM is mainly used for texture storage. Things like resolution or game settings don't actually influence it to the degree a lot of people have been led to think. Resolution was a big deal like 15 to 20 years ago when cards only had like 4, 8, 16, 32 megabytes of VRAM, and so on. Also, game engines rarely just shit the bed when they run out of VRAM. Instead, they'll automatically reduce texture resolution as required. That's one of the reasons why they'll sometimes gobble up all the VRAM they can. They need to know how much you really have so they can automatically adjust on the fly. I've seen several games where there's no visible difference between high and ultra texture quality apart from how much VRAM gets reserved. I don't mean the human eye can't see over 24 FPS, that kind of thing. I mean there's literally no difference. The only explanation I can see is that they took the high textures, enlarged them in Photoshop, and saved them as ultra textures. It's a psychology thing. People want to think they're getting value out of the thing they bought, so game developers are obliged to put useless placebo settings into games that only serve to degrade performance. Sometimes it's blatant, like the ultra-detailed waves Crysis 2 invisibly renders beneath city streets. I challenge you, show me a mainstream game where you can reliably tell the difference between high and ultra 100% of the time in a double-blind comparison. The only caveat is that render distance has to be the same. Needless to say, if the tell you notice is that the game runs noticeably worse, that doesn't count. I'm not saying you won't find any games that show noticeable difference, I'm just saying it won't be easy. That's the point. Medium and high, that's easy to see. Medium and low is impossible to miss, but high and ultra might as well be the same in most games I've played, except that you can get a much higher frame rate. My point is, VRAM use is massively overestimated by most people, and more often, VRAM capacity is just a marketing bullet point. Callie Cush 70 says, I genuinely hope this thing is extremely successful so we see more competition in the handheld market. I'd absolutely love to see a PS Vita 2 or a Microsoft Xbox Series mobile. Lack of games killed the PSP, lack of games killed the Vita, and lack of games would kill the Vita 2 again. What makes the Steam Deck so interesting, at least to me, is that I already own a few Steam games, and there's more being released all the time, regardless of whether the Steam Deck exists or not, so a game drought is impossible. Microsoft already has all the software necessary for backwards compatibility with previous Xbox generations, so they could theoretically release a handheld capable of playing all past Xbox games. I don't think a handheld Xbox 360 would justify $400 to very many people, though. An Xbox customer would probably also want to play current Xbox games, which just isn't practical for a lot of reasons. The biggest one is that while GPU performance can easily be variable, meaning you can lower resolution, you can reduce level of detail, you can reduce draw distance, and so on, CPU performance is either good enough to run a game well or it's not. If you want a game made to run on one CPU to run on a significantly slower CPU, a developer would need to actually go back and rethink how the game's designed at its core. That means a ton of work. There's clearly at least a little leeway in CPU performance considering the Series X and Series S have different clock speeds, but probably not very much. The difference between the S and X likely means that developers design games to run well on the S and then scale them up for the more powerful X rather than the other way around. What this amounts to is that a handheld capable of reliably running all Xbox Series games as intended would unavoidably require 8 very fast Zen 2 or better CPU cores. These by themselves would require several times the power budget of the entire Steam Deck. Microsoft would never be able to get developers to go back and redesign all their Xbox Series games to be compatible with the CPU you'd put in a handheld, so it's a safe bet there will never be a standalone Xbox handheld system unless the market changes dramatically. However, a streaming handheld is certainly very possible and could be sold quite cheaply since Microsoft could rely on long-tail xCloud and Game Pass revenue for profitability. Maybe it could even stream from your own Xbox while at home to improve image quality and latency while using xCloud if you don't have an available Xbox or you're away from home. That would be neat. I doubt they'd be keen on letting you play Steam games though. Will all models of the Steam Deck have a glass screen or just the 512GB model? I don't have a specific person I'm answering for this one, or well, maybe I do. It would make a lot of sense. Just one person who doesn't read. Anyway, certain corners of the internet keep repeating that the 64GB and 256GB versions of the Steam Deck will have a plastic screen like the Nintendo Switch. We've seen nothing to actually indicate this. I think this confusion arose because the Steam Deck's model comparison page says the 512GB model has a premium anti-glare etched glass screen, while the other models don't have any details specified about their screens. This anti-glare etched screen is some kind of fancy glass that doesn't reflect as much light, or rather it disperses the light differently. A little like how you can get a monitor with a matte screen instead of a gloss screen to help reduce reflections in a bright environment. But remember that when there's no reflections on them, glossy screens often look nicer than non-glossy anti-reflective screens. And you can always add an anti-glare screen protector if you feel you need it, but you can't remove built-in anti-reflective glass. Anyway, all of the screens will be glass, just different kinds. Stop saying they're plastic. Please, you're driving me crazy. Do you think Phil and Gabe would let Tim sit with them at their lunch table? Tim's a big boy and he can sit wherever he wants, as long as he's the one paying. Is Steam Deck destined for the same landfill as the rest of Valve's hardware experiments? Well, that's a bit of a loaded question, but I'll answer it anyway. Let's look at Valve's previous hardware. Steam machines were a disastrous failure, let's not dance around it. There was a good idea at the core of Steam machines, but there were simply too many market forces opposing the idea. It's not all bad news though. The work that went into SteamOS for the Steam machines eventually matured into the software powering the Steam Deck. Next, Steam controllers. These were actually a good idea, and if you used them for a while, you could get used to them, but they felt cheap, and to be fair, they were cheap. They cost less than any other controller you could buy at the time, at least in Canada, and they relied on flaky Steam input support to really shine. Steam input became its own thing. Steam controllers essentially became obsolete rather than simply being bad from the get-go. Next, there's Steam Link, which again became obsolete rather than being a bad product by any means. You don't need a streaming box anymore. Smart TVs, smartphones, tablets, just about everything else with a Wi-Fi connection can now be used in the place of a Steam Link. The technology behind Steam Link even lets you stream games from your home PC to your phone or another computer on cellular or at another person's house. I've tried it, and with decent internet, it's honestly just as good, if not better, than the performance GeForce Now or Google's abortion offer. Steam Link was a good idea. The hardware just isn't needed anymore. In VR, Vive was Valve's product and HTC manufactured it. Vive's controllers weren't much good, but the headset was arguably the best you could get, especially once you upgrade the head strap. And Valve Index is routinely in the best sellers on Steam. Even taking into account that this is based on gross revenue and not unit sales, it's crazy to call that a failure. The Index controllers aren't as robust as I'd like, but the 2 weeks I had one here, I was enthralled with it. I ended up getting a Quest 2 recently, and the unfortunate truth is that it's a better experience at about a third the price. Though, keep in mind, Facebook is hemorrhaging money on its VR unit because it sells them at or below cost. I don't care how rich Valve is, you can't honestly expect them to match Quest 2's pricing. It's the wireless that really does it for me though. I'd happily pay an extra couple $100s for a wireless Index. So, while Steam Controller, Steam Link, and Steam Machines were all ill-fated, let's say, they weren't bad ideas, and Valve supported them way longer than you would expect. Is Valve going to put out a desktop PC version of the Steam Deck? They certainly could, and we've seen what appear to be prototypes, but I don't honestly see a good reason to right away. If I had to guess, I would suggest those prototypes are actually deck dev kits. They need deck equivalent hardware to test with, and no such product existed at the time. You could get close, but not exact. Considering the deck is basically a stripped down Xbox Series S, I can see the appeal of a stripped down X equivalent as a desktop product. But they don't really have a good reason to get into that market. The handheld PC gaming space needs support. Desktop is fine. One more company selling PC hardware won't increase supply. Silicon chip production is a hard bottleneck. That might be a 2023 or 2024 project. If Valve started selling good high-end gaming PCs at a fair price, they would just all get bought by miners, so it doesn't really matter, does it? Can Steam Deck do ray tracing? I touched on this in an earlier video, and the answer is yes. The hardware to perform ray tracing technically exists, and the deck's lower resolution screen will make it that much easier than it would be otherwise, but it's still going to be totally impractical in my opinion. Steam Deck uses an AMD GPU, and they're a full generation behind NVIDIA on ray tracing performance, and in my opinion, even NVIDIA isn't where they really need to be for ray tracing to make sense as anything beyond a novelty. Maybe in 5 years or so, a few hardware generations. Steam Deck's ray tracing performance will be adequate for a dozen inevitable clickbait, wow-face thumbnailed "Ray tracing on Steam Deck?" videos on launch day, but its limited power budget will be much better spent on conventional lighting techniques. Don't enable ray tracing on the Steam Deck. It's dumb. Please don't make those videos. Please. Pixel Shade says, game developer here. One thing to note about Linux and Proton. Sure, when you're running Linux with a fast and dedicated GPU, Proton performance is generally worse than Windows, but on a Ryzen 2500U APU, which for reference would go in like a low to mid-range laptop, a lot of DX9 to DX11 games actually run better through the compatibility layer, Proton, than natively in Windows at 720p. The main reason being that DXVK, which is the DirectX to Vulkan translation layer, greatly improves memory bandwidth by stripping away the whole pipeline of preparing graphic instructions, draw calls, to the GPU via the CPU. This results in far fewer reads and writes to an already limited memory bus of an APU. As an example, an older game like Dishonored, I can never fully reach 60 FPS on my laptop in Windows. It regularly dips down to 45 and 50 FPS at weird places which are neither CPU nor GPU bound. With Proton in Linux, on the other hand, 60 FPS is easily achieved. Generally, performance in 1080p is worse than Windows by a couple percent due to being GPU constrained. However, at 720p, Proton wins in a lot of games, even if it's not native. So, with this being said, Proton is not necessarily having a negative impact on games, especially when it comes to APU performance at lower resolutions, such as in the Steam Deck. I don't really have anything to add here, I just wanted to highlight this comment. I think it came from Digital Foundry's video. Basically what he's saying is that running games through Proton in Linux helps to eliminate a lot of CPU and memory bottlenecks that would be present running the same game in Windows. This is one reason why you might not necessarily want to install Windows on your Steam Deck. I've made many a lengthy, misleading shitpost in my day, but this guy sounds legit to me. Good info. Quietus Plus says, I'm glad they didn't just throw out everything they learned from the Steam controller. That thing had so much potential. Steam controller certainly did have a lot of potential. I loved mine. I used it for a long time. Valve's hardware and software divisions don't always line up though, and the user experience just wasn't where it needed to be. This is the subject of another video I plan to make soon. The short version, I really liked the Steam controller, but I think Steam Input as a tool is far too powerful for its functionality to be left to end users. I have a lot more to say on this. John Von Shepard put down his favorite bottle of glue for long enough to say, Steam should have partner of with Microsoft or Sony, big mistake not to. No. Sony and Microsoft have literally nothing of value to offer Valve here, and they wouldn't be interested in helping them even if the terms of the deal were completely one-sided. Sony, as in the parent of PlayStation, is actually not doing very well right now, especially in Japan, and Phil Spencer can dance around it all day, but Microsoft would throw a party if Steam ever shut down. They're valued partners today, but Steam's what's keeping the Microsoft store on Windows a barren wasteland. John 3 Rockaholic, several other people, and even Digital Foundry said something to the effect of, "It would be good if devs started including Steam Deck performance presets in their games." It's not very frequent that I completely disagree with Digital Foundry on something, but this is not going to happen, and it's not a good idea. There's 3 reasons. Number 1, Steam Deck, by Valve's own numbers, won't be a large enough market by itself for developers to care about supporting it in that way, not anytime soon. Based on a Steam bug that temporarily revealed true queue lengths, they're probably only expecting to manufacture around 1 million units by the end of 2022. It's possible they could dramatically ramp up production, but I think that's unlikely. Maybe a little, but they're not going to just start willy-nilly pumping out 1 million a month no matter how many reservations the Steam Deck might have. The chip shortage makes that impossible, and you really can't ramp up a production line that dramatically, even under the best of circumstances. Looking at the Valve Index, which is an even more costly project to Valve than the Steam Deck is, it's clear Valve prefers to risk inconveniencing customers with long backorder queues over risking overinvestment in manufacturing capacity when they might be left holding the bag once initial demand is satisfied. If Valve had a diverse product portfolio like Sony, a long history in manufacturing like Nintendo, or extremely deep profit margins like Apple, they might be more adventurous. But none of those describe Valve and the Steam Deck. Reason number 2, Valve publicly said they want a third-party ecosystem beyond Steam Deck. They envision a wide range of portable gaming PCs in the handheld form factor. That means some would have a higher resolution screen and more powerful hardware, while some would be cheaper and have less powerful hardware. And some would be more expensive and have less powerful hardware. A single Steam Deck settings preset doesn't make sense, and I have to assume Valve is telling developers this. Also, time is a thing, and if the deck's successful, there will probably be future hardware revisions that change its performance characteristics, so a single preset would be obsolete quickly and misleading. Reason number 3, it's unnecessary, totally unnecessary. Here's how it'll actually work. You'll select the medium preset and play your game. If it's not fast enough, you'll go back and pick the low preset instead. That's it. No need for a special hardware preset. You probably won't want to use the high or ultra presets even if it's a game the deck can easily run at that level, because on a small, low-resolution screen, those visual improvements will be even less noticeable than usual and drain your battery even faster. There is no need for bespoke Steam Deck settings presets. Dynamic Hunter speculates, "The sticks that know when you're touching them is just killing the Switch Joy-Con drift, lamau." What Dynamic Hunter is suggesting here is that the reason the Steam Deck has touch-sensitive sticks is for rejecting input when they're not being touched as a means of preventing stick drift, which plagues the Nintendo Switch Joy-Cons. Stick drift is certainly something we should be wary of, but no, the capacitive sensors on the sticks and touchpads are for additional control customization. You can see the way it's used in one of Valve's demo videos, where touching the stick enables gyro aiming. This was a very common use case with the Steam controller's touchpads. Motion-enhanced aiming is something that you can configure on a per-game basis. It's not something to disguise a hardware defect. Can Steam Deck power VR games? Yes and no. Gabe Newell used theoretical compatibility with Oculus Quest as an example to communicate that Valve isn't planning to artificially lock out any PC-compatible hardware, even hardware made by their direct competitors. There's a long history of this nonsense in the console space, so he wants us to know that that's not happening here. As far as actually running VR games, though, it's complicated. Yes, Steam Deck could easily run circles around hardware found in Oculus Quest and even Quest 2. However, Quest games are built specifically to run on that platform, and PC VR games are built to run on high-end PCs. You'll be very hard-pressed to find a PC VR game that can run enjoyably on Steam Deck, even at reduced resolution and frame rate, because they were developed with hardware equivalent to a GTX 970 as a bare minimum. And being honest, the only reason I want a faster video card right now is to play VR games better. I don't have a 970, I have a 1080 Ti, a video card that absolutely shits on a 970. And I still want something faster for VR specifically. So, as far as having an enjoyable VR experience using a Steam Deck, I don't think so. Maybe Beat Saber or something, it's fairly simple. It would probably be good enough to watch videos in virtual desktop. Anyway, don't buy a Steam Deck thinking that it's a backdoor into PC VR, it really isn't. Will achievements work while I'm offline? Yes, they'll sync when you reconnect to the internet, but unless Valve can fix this, they'll only record the time you connected to Steam as the time you got them instead of the time you actually got the achievement. Why isn't Valve making more units up front? If you reserve a unit right now, you'll have to wait a year or so for it to arrive. That's crazy. Well, the short answer is, look up the THQ U-Draw tablet. That's why Valve didn't order millions of a product they weren't absolutely sure would be successful. Imagine if Deck's a great product except for one tiny thing that completely ruins it. Like the buttons sometimes get stuck when you press them, or the screen is damaged by sunlight somehow, or the sticks sometimes develop a defect and stop working after 6 months of use. Oh, that'd be embarrassing. They'd have to decide, are we going to stand behind this thing and replace every unit we've sold, shipping and refurbishing costs included, or are we going to Google ourselves and make people never trust a product we make ever again? It would be an enormous financial liability, even for a company the size of Valve. This is their first product of this type, and there's a very real possibility they could overlook something and it all goes horribly wrong. I'm not saying anything negative about Valve here. It's a responsible business decision. Why isn't Valve advertising the Steam Deck? Everyone I know knows what a Switch is, but nobody's heard of a Steam Deck. That's an easy one. There's no reason to advertise something you already can't manufacture enough to keep up with demand. Maybe check back with me in 2024. Why is the Steam Deck coming out now specifically? There's a hardware shortage. It seems like a terrible time. Looking at the PC technology roadmap, 3 years from now will be prime time for them to release a refined version with lessons learned from this first attempt. I explained the reasons I think Deck could be a really ideal product in the first video I did on it, but the first version of any product is rarely the one that really takes off. Steam Deck 1.0 is going to be a fully featured product, but it'll be an experiment. And right now, people are going to be more prepared to be forgiving of a product's faults. I'm not saying I don't think Valve is going to stand behind the Steam Deck. I'm not saying I think it's just an experiment for them, but it is the first product of this type they've made. They need to start small. Will new games be nerfed so they can run on the Steam Deck? Meaning, is a game developer today going to say, I want to have my game run really well on the Steam Deck, so we need to cut these things out of the game to make it perform adequately? No need to worry about that. First, because the Steam Deck won't represent a big enough share of the market to matter to developers in that way for a very long time. And second, because it's unnecessary. The medium and low graphics presets already exist. What does Steam Deck only supporting Wi-Fi AC instead of Wi-Fi AX, also known as Wi-Fi 6, really mean? Both Wi-Fi AC and AX support 2.4 GHz and 5 GHz networks. In real-world situations, Wi-Fi AX is around 30% faster than Wi-Fi AC. AX also supports a newer encryption standard, WPA3. I don't personally think either of these are really deal breakers. For most people, Wi-Fi AC is still capable of transmitting data faster than their home internet plan delivers it. Lack of WPA3 is disappointing, but I think most people still have lots of old WPA2 hardware, so it's not like you can just switch your network over right now anyway. Whatever they saved by having slower Wi-Fi hopefully allowed them to spend more on something that everyone benefits from, like a better screen or more reliable sticks. My home network is still Wi-Fi AC, and I can still easily download games at like 40 megabytes a second. It's plenty fast enough for in-home game streaming, and this really isn't that big of a deal. A reply to one of my previous videos asked, AMD GPU drivers on Linux are a lot better than I'm giving them credit for. Why am I being so negative? This is in reference to some comments I made about AMD and Linux in a previous video. The problem in my mind has to do with the definition of bug. If you ask an average person what a bug in a video game is, they'll tell you it's when something doesn't work right, or maybe the game crashes. But that's not exactly accurate. A bug is unexpected behavior, not specifically incorrect behavior. According to the Steam hardware survey, 99%, not a made-up number, literally 99%, of PC gaming is done on Windows or Mac compared to 1% on some flavor of Linux. If the proportion of AMD versus NVIDIA GPU ownership is similar on Linux to how it is on Windows, only around 15% use AMD. So the total market share specifically of AMD on Linux is currently just 0.15% of the PC gaming market. Also, it's been my experience that most developers prefer NVIDIA hardware because for a while now theirs has been more powerful and feature-rich for development. Altogether, this means far less direct and indirect bug testing and reporting for AMD hardware, and especially AMD hardware running under Linux. Hypothetically, if AMD has perfect drivers while NVIDIA's are total garbage, due to their massive market share advantage, NVIDIA's buggy behavior would become the correct behavior, since it produces the intended result, even if that intended behavior is a result of the code executing incorrectly. Even if, as a consequence, the code then breaks on AMD hardware that is producing an accurate result. This sucks. It's a shitty situation. I don't like it. It's not the way things should be. But developing for quirks happens all the time in software, hardware, and web development. Now that's native Linux software. What about software running through Wine/Proton? Unfortunately, you run into the same problem, just from a different perspective. It doesn't actually matter how good or bad a vendor's drivers are. It matters what hardware is used most during development and testing. Think about it. These are games made to run on either AMD's famously terrible Windows drivers or NVIDIA's industry standard, though probably still buggy Windows drivers. And now you're trying to run software built to exploit or work around those bugs on a completely different operating system, which, according to many of you, has much better, more accurate drivers. But accurate doesn't mean produces the intended result. I would guess that the compatibility of Wine or Proton or whatever combination thereof really is approaching 100% like Valve claims, but only in code that's written to spec. So when you tell me that AMD's drivers on Linux are actually way better than I'm giving them credit for, you're missing my point. Because in the end, it doesn't actually matter how good they are. It matters if they execute code identically to the way they do on buggy drivers on a different operating system. Average developers being able to quickly test their code using Steam Deck as a reference platform will help things along though. If Steam Deck is a runaway success, and yes, 2022 is the year of the Linux desktop, this could all begin to change, but it'll take a while. When is Switch Pro coming and how will it compare to Steam Deck? We don't know for sure there's a Switch Pro coming, but in the wake of Nintendo's tremendous success with a single convertible form factor versus their old strategy of having a discrete home console and handheld, each with their own mutually exclusive game library, there's little doubt that its eventual successor will be functionally similar. Nintendo is currently enjoying an overwhelmingly dominant position that they haven't had since the Famicom days. This means a few things. First, they're disinclined to release new hardware prematurely since the massive Switch install base is very attractive to developers. You can make a niche Switch game and it'll still have a good chance of finding an audience. This is why they made a new Metroid game. There's finally enough of a customer base to make it a safe bet. Second, Switch is comparatively cheap to develop for, again making it very attractive to developers. If hardware is capable of high-end graphics, consumers will rightfully expect high-end graphics from games on that console. Third, with their name uncharacteristically untarnished, a console launch right now would have enough excitement behind it that they can count on strong launch sales. Fourth, the silicon shortage is predicted to extend into late 2022, maybe 2023 even, and they need to be able to put a product on shelves in quantity, so a brand new chip design would be very difficult. Fifth, when you're at the top, there's only one direction you can go. Switch is only barely powerful enough to make PS4 and Xbox One ports feasible. PS5 and Xbox Series ports will be untenable for high-end games unless the games are designed not to take real advantage of these consoles' hardware, especially the super-fast SSD storage. If and when PS5 and Xbox Series consoles begin to really take off, Nintendo will have no choice but to release more capable hardware if they want to stay relevant. They learned this with the failure of the underpowered Wii U, which was sunk, among other things, by its lack of third-party support. With all of these pros and cons in mind, an ideal time for a new Nintendo platform, likely backwards compatible with Switch software, would be sometime in the second half of 2022. Launching hardware with a new Zelda title has worked very well for them in the past, so it might come out in sync with a new Zelda game. Aonuma will appreciate a few extra months for polish. Nintendo has a long history of putting out final novelty hardware revisions right before the next generation of hardware. They did it with the Game Boy Advance, they did it with the 3DS, they did it with the Wii, and in my view, that's probably what the OLED Switch is as well. Nintendo is unpredictable, but here's my wild speculation. they'll release not one but two hardware products in sync with Breath of the Wild 2. First, a new budget-priced but possibly still OLED-equipped Switch Lite with cost-optimized hardware and sold with a razor-thin initial profit margin. It probably wouldn't even include a charger. It would primarily target lower-income households and countries, but it would also attract Switch Lite owners who want another upgrade. This would balloon Switch's install base one last time and ensure there's a product available for any remaining Switch games still in development. They could effortlessly sell millions of these. Second, a next-generation premium platform with a new name at maybe $349 to start, with enough headroom built into the price that they can lower it to $299 as stock eases after the first year. No Pro on the end, no U on the end, and no Super prefix. Name and functionality confusion was another major component of why the Wii U failed. It needs to be something distinct sounding. Nintendo Horizon, Nintendo Platypus, whatever, just as long as people understand it's a different platform. There probably won't be a Breath of the Wild 2 pack-in edition. That's what you do when you're not sure if you can sell. Since Nintendo is in a long-term partnership with Nvidia, it would be shockingly stupid, not even in a Nintendo way, for them to not include DLSS in a next-generation platform. This would give a so-called Switch Pro an almost free doubling in GPU hardware performance. Combined with a more modern GPU cluster, a more modern manufacturing process, say freed up Samsung 8nm capacity, and CPU cores of both higher clock speed and in greater number, they would have something that's minimally capable of 1080p DLSS renditions of next-generation games when docked. 1080p 60 would be fine, I think. I'm not a huge proponent of 4K, especially when it would probably mean dropping to 30 FPS. Again, that was all just speculation. Nintendo's very hard to predict. That's what I'd do. Just being aware of the market, it wasn't hard to predict that Microsoft would probably release a high-end and low-end console and what their rough costs and capabilities might be. Nintendo has strange priorities. Next-gen consoles make our hardware impractical to port new games onto? Here's a new model with an OLED screen. As for how it would compare with Steam Deck, it's probably a safe bet that Switch Pro won't be quite as powerful, but DLSS will make up the gap. Remember, with the Switch, Nintendo just took an old Nvidia chip, claimed to have customized it by making it slower, and called it a day. Whatever powers the next-generation Switch-like device would presumably be an actual custom chip. You can count on Nintendo still keeping it simple. A device that's too powerful would both cost too much to produce and require too much investment from developers. But if they go too cheap, they won't be able to handle ports of PS5 or Xbox Series games, and I think that would be their main motivator to put out upgraded hardware.
But yeah, it's an LCD screen, optically bonded LCD. Is that just an OLED?
No. If it was an OLED, they would call it an OLED. Valve's Steam Deck, who's it for? That video might have started off a little embarrassing, but at least the title's a good question. Who is the Steam Deck for? I don't want to be hyperbolic, but honestly, it's for just about anyone, although different people would use it in different ways. The idea of basically a high-performance Switch alternative is cool, but what I'm most excited about is the idea of making my Steam library portable. If Humble Bundle wasn't mostly worthless over the past couple years, I'd have well over 1,000 games on Steam by now. That's a crazy amount of entertainment to lock down to one chair in one room in one building. Steam Deck is both the best value games platform you can buy and among the best value general purpose PCs you can buy. I can see it being great for a console-only gamer who wants a cheap, streamlined entry into PC gaming. It'll be great for me as a primarily PC gamer who wants to be able to play his Steam library on the go and stop rebuying games on Switch. It's also much better value than most any entry-level PC you can buy right now. Even if you assemble a computer yourself from used parts, you'd currently have a hard time beating Steam Deck's pricing, with the exception of being able to cheaply get a lot more storage by using a hard drive instead of an SSD. If I could order one today, I'd buy one for myself. If I could order two today, I'd buy one for myself and one for my elderly mother and attach it to a dock. It's way more powerful than the computer I built her like 5 years ago and also costs way less. Despite how often I see the question asked, who is the Steam Deck for? I think a much better question would be, who is it not for? It's not for you if you don't care about portable gaming. It's not for you if you don't like Steam. It's not for you if you have a strong aversion to gamepad controls or exclusively play games best played with a mouse and keyboard. Steam Deck certainly has a lot of input options, but it's going to be a hassle to configure them sometimes. Steam Deck's not for you if you demand the best graphics. Most games will play best at medium settings or below, and to extend your battery life, you'll want to use the lowest settings you can tolerate. And in that vein, if you need long battery life, Steam Deck is just not going to cut it for you. The battery may only last for 2 to 3 hours on the most demanding games, and that's when it's brand new. Every time you recharge a battery, its capacity diminishes slightly, and Steam Deck's battery is not user serviceable. Steam Deck isn't for you if you need a gaming PC urgently. Even if you put in a reservation today, you'll probably be waiting at least a year before your ticket gets called. Steam Deck isn't for you if you just don't like PC gaming and everything that comes with it, like troubleshooting compatibility issues, input annoyances, and a lot of cheating in multiplayer, as well as less multiplayer population in general. Steam Deck technically could, but almost certainly won't, support local wireless multiplayer like is possible with a Nintendo Switch or 3DS. So if that's important to you, then you don't want a Steam Deck. And due to port forwarding nonsense, having a bunch of people at one house playing on a bunch of Steam Decks might be a pain in the ass. If after hearing all that, you're not sure you want a Steam Deck, by all means, you should cancel your reservation. In fact, you should probably cancel right away, even if you think you might want one. My reservation got bumped back to Q3, so you'd be doing me a big favor.
It's got AMD's latest Zen 2 cores. Steam Deck, meanwhile, only has to deliver 720p.
Hi. I have a question. How are you people still in business? This is a bonus. You can stop watching, but I have to get this off my chest. For a period of like 2 years after Steve Jobs or whoever replaced him under the turtleneck got on stage and used the word chamfer, you couldn't go one article or video without these goofballs talking about chamfers. A chamfer is what you get when you have a sharp edge. I don't mean sharp like it cuts you necessarily, I mean sharp like a 90-degree angle. It's when you get a sharp edge and you divide it into two edges. Like you've got this single 90-degree angle, right? Chamfer it and you now have two consecutive 45-degree angles, or a 30-degree angle and a 60-degree angle, whatever. It's a basic elementary machining term, and these galactic intellects behaved as though Apple had invented the concept. Suddenly it was chamfers all day long. The whole tech reporting industry had been replaced with pod people obsessed with chamfers. Holy shit, you see that new HTC phone? Yeah, the edges aren't chamfered, OMG guys. Hey, you see that new LG phone? Yeah, no chamfers. I just got my new iPhone and you won't believe how good the chamfers feel. That's a 4S, Dave. It doesn't have chamfer technology. Go back in your hole. I was working in a machine shop at the time, and many of us used the word chamfer frequently, many times a day even. And I hadn't heard it outside work at all in my life. Then all of a sudden it's everywhere, and revolutionary. Jesus. Even today, you can Google the words Apple Chamfer. That's Chamfer. Google it. And it's just endless pages of discussion of how great chamfers are. Google it. A week earlier, virtually no one outside of machining or industrial design had ever spoken the word, and they certainly couldn't spell it. But holy shit, some guy in a turtleneck says it, and now this trivial, everyday machining operation is some kind of never-before-seen space-age technology. We're playing Alpha Centauri, and instead of researching the longevity vaccine, we researched chamfers, winning an instant tech victory. AC doesn't even have a tech victory? It does now. Chamfers. God damn. If you're younger or just weren't paying attention at the time, it's not as though we went from a world of consumer electronic goods with harsh 90-degree angles to one with pleasing chamfers. We already possessed edge rounding technology back in 2010. It's just that nobody had yet thought of making a marketing bullet point of edges. We were in a pre-chamfer mindset. The Great Chamfer Incident, or GFI, remains the single most damaging thing for Apple's reputation in my mind. Apple makes amazing hardware, I'll give them that. Their fancy new ARM laptop chip puts Intel and AMD to shame. It makes me wonder if we might be looking at the twilight of x86. And I have to respect them for putting out the iPhone SE. It restored some semblance of sanity to mid-range smartphone pricing. But their ability to take the mundane, put a logo on it, and get treated like visionaries by mainstream press has prevented me from ever taking a positive review of their products seriously again. How can I? Anyway, sorry, that's the chamfer rant. It's been stewing for about a decade, and I was already shitting on The Verge today, so this seemed like a great time to bring it up. I have a bunch more stuff coming. Please like, subscribe, share, Reddit, all that shit. That stuff, it genuinely helps a ton. I got something like 2/3 of the views on my my Steam Deck video from a single Reddit post. That was really cool. I read and reply to every comment I can. Thanks for watching. More coming soon. Maybe. Probably not.